Welcome to this session of Family Communication. This is the first of two sessions where we look at the research on how parents and children communicate with one another. And to get started, we have to make a couple of observations. First of all, this is a vast area of research. Many studies have been done and many books have been written about parents and kids in communication. That topic is far too broad for us to cover in this entire course, let alone a couple of sessions. So because of that, we're going to focus more narrowly on some of the types of messages and some of the broad dynamics that are inherent in the parenting project. If you want more specific information about how parents and their kids communicate, I encourage you to look into the research on those specific topics. So for example, if you're interested in how parents talk to their kids about sex, then that's a topic you need to look into with respect to the academic research. Or if you're interested in parents disciplining their kids, then that also is a very specific topic that you need to look into with respect to the academic research. And second, as we've seen with previous topics, there are a number of idiosyncrasies. All sorts of variables go into the relationship between parents and their kids as to how they communicate with each other. And so those variables have to be accounted for. It's not just the personalities of the people involved or the situations or the unique family dynamics. It's also the history of the parents and the teenagers. It's the presence of siblings. And of course, it's the specific topics themselves. And so, while we can talk about specific kinds of messages and broad areas of the research, there are so many intervening variables, it's difficult to make broad, sweeping conclusions. Well, having said that, let's focus in this session on specifically crucial messages that parents must send to their children. And we begin by talking about warmth and control messages. To be a parent inherently means you have to send certain messages to your children. Chief among them are what researchers call warmth and control messages. Warmth messages communicate to a child that they are supported, that they're loved, that they are cared for. It gives them a sense of acceptance. These warmth messages stand in opposition to control messages. Control messages send a message to this child that there are certain expectations of them, which if they are not met, there will be some kind of a sanction. Control messages are intended to restrict a child's behavior or what a child says. Control messages are opposite of warmth messages because all too often kids interpret control messages as the opposite of warmth messages. Yet to be a parent, to raise a child, is to necessitate the sending of both kinds of messages. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you consider your own upbringing, you can probably imagine a number of different ways in which your parents communicated warmth. They might have hugged you. They might have encouraged you with words of affirmation. But you can also think of words that were controlling of you, as when they told you not to say something, or that they denied permission for you to go somewhere. To be a parent, in essence, is to send warmth and control messages. And so there's been a lot of research that's looked into how these two concerns have influenced the communicative dynamics between parents and their kids. Warmth messages are especially important because they've been found to be consistently related to a child's positive emotional and psychological well-being. You see, kids need a consistent and frequent dose of warmth messages if they want to have a positive self-view, if they want to have appropriately high self-esteem, if they want to feel competent, if they want to be able to interact with the world in a positive way. And what's important is how a child perceives those warmth messages. A parent may intend to send a warmth message, but a child might not receive it as such. So, for example, a parent might think they are sending a warmth message when they encourage their child to try harder, or to do better, or to say something like, "I know you can do better." The problem is, though the parent intends that as a warmth message, the child might not take it as a warmth message at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The child might take it as a kind of message that sends the message of disapproval, or of somehow not meeting a parent's expectation. And so, although intentions are important, perceptions are more important. We also know from the research that the best warmth messages over a period of time are a mix of both verbal and nonverbal warmth messages. However, of the two, surprisingly, nonverbal warmth messages are more important. And the reason for that is because kids oftentimes will discount the verbal warmth messages. Sometimes, in particular in the teenage years, a child decides that a parent is simply supposed to say that to their child. And so, if a parent says to a child, "I'm proud of you," the child may think, well, of course you're supposed to say that to me. You're my parent. You don't really mean it. I haven't really done anything to earn that kind of a message. And so the verbal message is discounted. Now, kids, and again, especially teenagers, can discount a nonverbal message. But comparatively speaking, research finds they are more likely to discount the verbal messages. Now, that doesn't mean parents should stop sending verbal warmth messages. Far from it. Verbal warmth messages have been found to be absolutely crucial in the natural, healthy development of a child. But it does mean that a parent has to pay special attention to sending nonverbal warmth messages as well. In fact, in the research, those kids that benefit the most from whatever warmth messages are sent are those kids that experience a regular, frequent, consistent type, and yet a variety of both verbal and nonverbal warmth messages. Now let me stop for a moment and say that it's impossible to categorize a list of all the kinds of verbal or nonverbal warmth messages. Many of them are idiosyncratic to the particular situations in which a child finds themselves. So, for example, a child who's playing Little League Baseball may have opportunity to receive a different set of warmth messages than a child who's involved in ballet. Or it might be that a particular parenting style or a parent's personality naturally lends them to giving a different kind of warmth message than another parent. In fact, one of the things we find is that it's actually best if the two parents in a home send different kinds of warmth messages. This helps broaden the base of warmth messages and makes it more likely the kinds of positive outcomes we hope to see will actually come to pass. Now, in that light, we also know that each parent tends to have his or her own way of communicating warmth. They have a kind of go-to strategy. And much like the love languages we ran into in talking about the research about spousal communication, parents also tend to have a warmth message language. And although they're very similar, the idea of touch, for example, or words of affirmation, we also find that kids receiving those messages oftentimes have a similar kind of warmth message language. And so everything we've said about love language previously can be exported and dropped into this conversation about warmth messages between parents and kids. So how is it that parents come to send these warmth messages? Well, the research indicates that parents tend, initially anyway, to send the same kinds of warmth messages with about the same frequency as they receive from their family of origin. Or to put it differently, if you become a parent someday, your opening strategy and your opening way of doing warmth messages is likely going to be to replicate whatever warmth messages you received when you were a child growing up. We also know, comparatively speaking, that mothers tend to send more warmth messages than do fathers. Now, interestingly enough, kids tend to discount the warmth messages sent by their mother more than they do those of their father. So when fathers do send warmth messages, they tend to have a larger resonance. They tend to have greater impact than do the warmth messages sent by the mother. This is probably because of the kind of discounting effect that I mentioned a few moments ago. Fathers, however, often struggle particularly with sending warmth messages to their daughters, and this is especially true in the teenage years. We've said previously that fathers often struggle communicating with their daughters as their daughters move through puberty and into the adolescent years. The kinds of ways fathers use to communicate with daughters don't seem to be as appropriate in those years. And so it follows then that when it comes to warmth messages, fathers would similarly struggle. That is to say, the kinds of warmth messages they gave to their daughters when they were younger, fathers find difficult to extend to them during those teenage years. Yet the research finds that daughters need those warmth messages from their fathers in particular during those teenage years. Also, we know that certain kinds of warmth messages can be detrimental to a child's self-concept. So, for example, some families use teasing as a way of sending warmth messages. In fact, in the next session, we'll talk more specifically about the research on teasing and how that works in a family setting. But for now, suffice it to say there is research that finds that often there's a mismatch where a parent will try and use teasing as a way to send a warmth message, but it's perceived not at all as a warmth message. It's perceived as criticism, or it's perceived as some kind of a pot shot at someone's sense of self or sense of security. So to connect the dot, I said a moment ago that fathers often struggle communicating warmth messages to their teenage daughters. This is particularly true when the father's language of communicating warmth is teasing, because oftentimes teenage daughters become more sensitive to the teasing they receive from anyone, but in particular from family members, and in particular from fathers. We know that inconsistent warmth messages also can be detrimental. If you're not consistent in telling children that they are supported and loved and accepted, and you tell them you're proud of them, you tell them that you love them, you tell them all sorts of things like that, then the effect can't be as positive as it otherwise would be. Similarly, if there's a slew of them over certain periods of time and then they dry up, that also tends to be rather detrimental. I mentioned a moment ago that oftentimes kids will discount the warmth messages that parents send to them, and that's certainly true. But hollow warmth messages are the ones that are most often likely to be discounted. When my kids were younger and they were both involved in sports, oftentimes they would hear a coach say to them, "Good hustle, good hustle." What they knew was that the coach said that really when there was nothing else positive to say. And so the message from the coach, "Good hustle," became a hollow warmth message. Well, parents oftentimes send hollow warmth messages as well. And research finds that kids are remarkably good at picking up on the hollowness of warmth messages. And so therefore, sensing a hollow warmth message, kids are very quick to discount that warmth message. And in fact, ultimately, if all they get are hollow warmth messages, come to resent the parent for offering those hollow warmth messages. A more particular kind of warmth message that has been found to correlate as a detrimental effect is what we call a warmth message with a tag criticism. So a warmth message with a tag criticism occurs when a parent intends to say something positive or affirming to a child, but then follows it up immediately with what can be perceived as criticism. So for example, if a parent says to a child, "Honey, I am so proud of you because you tried so hard." And that's important because we know that you don't always try hard. So the warmth message the parent intended to send, which was pride about effort on the part of the child, is drowned out by the criticism at the end. We find oftentimes what kids hear is the criticism instead of the warmth message. And so almost every single piece of research that I have seen discourages the use of any kind of criticism in the same communicative moment that there is also the intention to send a warmth message. Well, if you think about your own experiences, you can probably imagine the broad array of kinds of warmth messages, how they were communicated, and all the other kinds of things that we've talked about. But warmth messages are just one half of the important dynamic we've talked about so far. The other half are control messages. You'll recall control messages are intended to restrict a kid's behavior. They're intended in some way to nudge or guide a child's behavior. They are perceived, usually accurately by children, as a kind of roadblock to what they would otherwise want to do. But these control messages have been found in the research to be absolutely crucial in the positive, healthy development of a child. So, for example, these control messages help a child know what is proper and improper behavior. These control messages help a child develop self-control. The control messages oftentimes can help a child develop sympathy and empathy. The establishment of limits, the monitoring of a child's behavior, all occur because of the presence of control messages. And unfortunately, parents have to send a lot of control messages. Interestingly, these control messages are intended not just to regulate behavior, but also to regulate attitude, to regulate thinking, to regulate emotional responses. So these control messages really have to do a lot of different things, and unfortunately, sometimes parents try and use the same control message to accomplish all of those outcomes. That's unfortunate because the research suggests that often the most effective control messages are those that are narrowly tailored to try and address one of those areas rather than multiple areas. One thing to think about in your own experiences with control messages is how your parents framed those messages. So, for example, it's possible for parents to frame control messages as either a command or a suggestion. As the term command indicates, a control message framed as a command invokes the power hierarchy from a parent to a child and basically says, "You can't do this," or "Don't do this." And there's an exertion of power on the parent's part that somehow stops or limits a child's behavior. So the denial of permission to use the car on a Friday night clearly is an exercise of power. It's also clearly a control message, and it's intended specifically to be taken as a command. No, you can't use the car. The other end of the spectrum, of course, is a suggestion. It's where a parent will say something to a child to try and guide their behavior, but not invoke that power hierarchy. So, for example, as a child is getting ready to leave the house, a parent might say, "Hey, you might want to make sure you take a jacket. It's supposed to be cold tonight." So the parent is suggesting that something be done. Or if a parent says to a child, "Boy, when I was in school, it always helped me to be able to do the hardest task first, and then to move on to those that are easier." So a parent in that case is sending a control message. It's a light control message. It's not a command. It's a suggestion. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, as you might imagine, parents tend to have their own natural tendency to use control messages that either are framed as commands or suggestions. Two, the truth of the matter is that suggestions and commands are not dichotomous. It's a continuum where a parent's control message lies somewhere between a suggestion and a command. Because of this, it's important to understand the nuances and the subtleties of all of this. Often what a parent thinks is a suggestion is taken more as a kind of command. This is especially true in the teenage years when adolescents are bent on exploring their own freedoms and establishing their own identities. But one of the things we have to say is that ideally, as a child makes that transition from pre-adolescence into adolescence, there would be a decrease in the number of commands that a parent issues and an increase in the number of suggestions. The reason for this is because you're wanting kids to internalize behavior. You're wanting them to choose for themselves what it is the parents have tried to instill in the child. If all a parent does throughout the time that a child is at home is issue command after command after command, then that doesn't allow the kind of internalization. And you may get compliance from the child, meaning the child may do what you ask them to do or not do what you prevent them from doing, but they won't internalize it and genuinely be persuaded for themselves to make that choice if left to their own devices without a command. Another way to think of these control messages is to put them on a continuum between explicit and implicit messages. Well, obviously, explicit messages, like a command, for example, is clear-cut. It's unmistakable. It's the parent that says to the child explicitly, no, you can't use the car tonight. Or it's the parent that says to the child, get upstairs and clean your room right now. Implicit control messages, on the other hand, are far more subtle. They're often missed. Parents sometimes do this by acting with passive aggression, or parents sometimes will use nonverbal cues to do this. So parents, for example, will sometimes communicate their disappointment with the child with heavy sighs, or with the rolling of the eyes, or with some other nonverbal kind of maneuver to subtly indicate a kind of control. The suggestions I mentioned a moment ago oftentimes carry implicit control messages. So if you're thinking back to your own upbringing right now, you might be able to think of your parents as giving you more often implicit control messages or explicit control messages. So for example, there are three common types of implicit control messages. Innocuous questions, as for example, when a mother says to her daughter, "Are you wearing that?" is really an implicit kind of control message. The parent has made it fairly evident to the child that they prefer them not wear that, but they did it by framing it as a question, trying to get the child to think about it. And so it becomes not so much a command as much as a suggestion, and it's not explicit, it's more implicit. A second kind of implicit type of control message are those nonverbal expressions of disapproval that I mentioned a moment ago, the heavy sigh, for example. And the third type of common implicit control message are offhanded references. So for example, if a parent says, "You know, we never did that when I was a child," or "Boy, you'd think that if people had sense, they wouldn't do that." It's just an offhanded comment, but it's intended to be heard by the child. It's intended to be taken as an implicit suggestion of what the child ought or ought not to do. And so, again, if you think back to your own upbringing, you might recall one of those three types of implicit control messages as you were growing up. Interestingly enough, those control messages that parents send are more likely to be properly understood by a child, and therefore more likely to be effective if they occur in the broader context of healthy, consistent warmth messages. Or to put it differently, those control messages are most effective when they don't stand alone, but when the child also has a steady dose of warmth messages as well. All of one and the lack of another is never a good thing. Now, into this mix comes two different styles of delivering these control messages. So it's not just a suggestion or a command or an implicit or an explicit kind of a continuum. These styles are two broad ways that parents tend to look at and tend to use control messages as they interact with their children. So for example, the controlling style is the style where much of what the parent tries to do with respect to the child holds on to power. It's called controlling because the parent tends to leverage that power differential as the way to motivate the child to do things, as a way to guide the child's behavior, and as a backdrop for much of the communication between the parent and the child. That stands opposite what we call a conversational style. In the conversational style, a parent might explain the reasoning behind the commands that are given, or they might offer suggestions that are softened in such a way as to be included with positive kinds of comments. A conversational style implies less hierarchy, less exertion of power, and more a kind of rational partnership with a child. Now, it becomes important because, as I said earlier, how kids perceive either a warmth or a control message is more important than what a parent intends. All too often, parents don't think they have a controlling style when in reality they do. And as you might imagine, parents that have an excessively controlling style tend to have less likelihood of the kinds of positive outcomes they would like their children to have. Another kind of important, crucial message that parents have to send is disappointment. I said earlier, to be a parent is to have to control children and send them warmth messages. Unfortunately, to be a parent often is to communicate disappointment to your children. Because you see, parents inherently have expectations of their kids. They not only have hopes and dreams for them in the broad sense, they have very specific, situational, almost momentary expectations of them. So, for example, a parent has an expectation of how quickly a child will clean her room after she's been asked to clean her room. Or they have expectations about whether a child's room will meet the cleanliness standard. And so, because a parent oftentimes is trying to control and shape and guide a child's behavior, inevitably there are expectations, and inevitably there will be disappointment. But what that means then is that parents have to find a way to communicate this disappointment to their children. All too often, the communication of disappointment isn't even on a parent's radar. The problem, of course, is that how a parent communicates disappointment has been found in the research to have significant impacts on children. We know, for example, that children, generally speaking, want their parents' approval, and that kids that feel as if they've pleased their parents typically tend to develop in a more healthy manner than kids that often sense that they have not pleased their parents. And so therefore it's incumbent upon parents to think long and hard about how it is they communicate disappointment. Now, this is a challenge for many parents because the communication of disappointment oftentimes occurs so quickly. It occurs in the midst of a situation without parents actually thinking it through. And so because of that, parents oftentimes are frankly not that good at communicating disappointment to their children. Now, if we stop for a moment, again, and think back to your own experiences growing up, I would ask you to ponder how your parents communicated their disappointment to you. Did they come right out and say, "Boy, I'm disappointed in you"? Did they kind of hedge that and kind of beat around the bush to let you know they were disappointed? Or perhaps they never communicated they were disappointed with you, either because you were the perfect child or because they just never communicated that. Well, in pondering all this, I want you to consider this from the research. There tend to be two kinds of disappointment that parents have to communicate to their kids. The first of which is what you probably thought of already. It's what's called situational disappointment. It's the communication to a child that a parent is disappointed in them in this particular situation. So, for example, if a child has just lied to a parent might say to that child, "Honey, I am so hurt. I am so sad and disappointed that you lied to me. You know we don't lie. You know that it's wrong to lie, and yet you just disappointed me because you lied." So if a parent says that, in that particular situation, what's triggered the not meeting of the expectation is the lie the child told to the parent. And so these situational disappointments can be expressed implicitly or explicitly. And in fact, most parents tend to fall into a pattern of either the explicit articulation of disappointment or the implicit articulation of disappointment. So for example, sometimes a parent will communicate implicitly that they are disappointed with their child if they refuse to speak to them. If a child wants to talk about something, if, for example, a child tells a lie to a parent and the parent says, "You just lied to me," and the child says, and the parent says, oh, and just non-verbally kind of looks as if they've been hurt, and the child says, I'm sorry, and the parent just walks away. Clearly, there's an implicit indication of disappointment there. We find that these implicit kinds of expressions of disappointment can have very negative consequences on kids, although again, the communication of disappointment, unlike the warmth and control messages, tends to be highly idiosyncratic. In fact, research finds that often if a kid has received so many disappointment messages from parents over time, that kids tend to tune out those messages. They, in essence, develop a kind of emotional callousness to the parent's disappointment message. And so they discount or outright ignore many of those explicitly sent situational disappointment messages. The other kind of disappointment message is what's called enduring disappointment. So if situational disappointment is tied to a particular situation, the lie the child tells the parent, enduring disappointment is communication to a child that the child himself or herself is a disappointment, that across contexts, in a very general sense, a parent is disappointed with the child. So if a parent, for example, says something like, I can't believe I raised a child who has so little respect for me that she lies to me, a parent is communicating enduring disappointment. It's called enduring because it's not tied to a particular situation. Instead, it seems as if the parent's disappointment is tied with something about the child himself or herself. It seems to be related to who the child is, to their inherent personality, to what they're about, to who they've become. Now, as you might imagine, enduring disappointment is particularly powerfully potent with respect to how it affects kids. Kids that receive frequent or strong messages of enduring disappointment are oftentimes maladjusted as they grow up. They oftentimes find themselves at a greater risk of being involved in antisocial behaviors. There's pretty good research that finds a growing sense of resentment among kids that receive these enduring messages of disappointment from parents. Now, that's tragic, but what's doubly tragic is the fact that most parents don't even realize they're sending messages of enduring disappointment. In fact, in the research, parents tend to be far more cognizant of these situational disappointment messages they send, but the enduring disappointment messages, they tend not to realize they are being sent. And that's too bad, because these enduring disappointment messages can do a lot of damage to the children. Well, another kind of crucial parent message that we'll talk about in this session is related to disappointment. It's what are called incompetence messages. You see, throughout the parenting project, in particular when kids are young, we find that parents find themselves communicating messages to their children about their children's competence, about their ability to do something. Now, that competence can be in a very specific situation, like learning to tie a shoe, or it can be in a broader sense about whether, for example, a child is good at taking responsibility. Regardless, parents often unintentionally communicate to their kids that they are competent or that they are incompetent. And as you might imagine in the research, when parents send messages of incompetence to kids, they are potentially destructive. You see, in particular in the younger years, there's a lot of psychological research that finds that kids need affirmation. They need support. They need this continual building up of security. They need to feel as if they can master their environment. In fact, the road to maturity is oftentimes marked by the ability of a child to master things in his or her environment. Well, an incompetence message basically says to a child, you can't master your environment. You can't do it. There's something wrong with you because you can't do this. It suggests a lack of ability. It suggests a lack of talent. And so what happens is kids hear these incompetence messages and they interpret them in a way that suggests that not only are parents disappointed with them, but more narrowly, a parent has told the child they are incapable. And so that provides a disincentive for the child to continue to do things to try and succeed. You see, the self-concept is a fragile thing, and building self-esteem is an important thing, and both are eroded, sometimes with surprising quickness, by messages of incompetence. Most parents, as I said, don't intend to send an incompetence message to their kids, or if they do, they intend to send it only in a very negative, narrow sense, not realizing how incompetence messages can have much greater effects. You see, one of the things we know is that parents who, for example, tell kids that they can't do something send a clear incompetence message. But when parents take over the doing of something too quickly, as for example when a child is learning to tie their shoe, or for example when a teenager is learning to drive, they send an incompetence message. When a parent reviews the report card that a child brings home from school, they run the risk of sending an incompetence message. There are dismissive signals that parents often send to their kids, the heavy sighs and the rolling of the eyes and things like that, that send messages to kids that they are incompetent. Now, like we saw earlier with messages related to disappointment, it's impossible to create a roster of incompetence messages. Each parent tends to have his or her own way of communicating messages of incompetence. And in case you're wondering, there is research that finds that fathers, compared to mothers, more frequently unintentionally send messages of incompetence than do their mothers. And so what ends up happening is that parents, being unaware of the kinds of incompetence messages they send, oftentimes stumble into messages of incompetence. Now, there are particular kinds of ways of communicating incompetence that the research has found to be particularly devastating. So the use of sarcasm, or the use of mockery, or the use of ridicule, any of those three become very destructive with respect to a child's self-concept. And so, as a parent, you want to steer as clear as possible, especially from mockery and ridicule. Now, in the next session, we'll talk more fully about the research on sarcasm. But here, let me say that sarcasm, in a sense, can reside at this level of harshness, this level of possible hurt. Ridicule and mockery are two other forms of communication that are far more hurtful. In essence, they sting more than sarcasm. Sarcasm can sting, and sarcasm can fall across the line into the hurtful category. But mockery and ridicule are clearly over the line and almost always tend to have significant detrimental negative impacts on children. This is especially true among young children, although research finds teenagers are surprisingly sensitive to ridicule and mockery. Regardless, if a parent sends a message to a child of his or her incompetence and does so with ridicule or mockery, they run the risk of doing significant negative damage to the child as the child grows up. Now, what's interesting about this is that compared to mothers, fathers do tend to make greater use of sarcasm and criticism in the sending of messages of incompetence. That's particularly true when fathers are interacting with their sons. Sons are more likely to receive incompetence messages from fathers than those sons are from mothers. And interestingly enough, there's some intergenerational research that finds that if a son receives a lot of these incompetence messages from the father in the form of sarcasm or mockery or ridicule, when that son grows up and has children of his own, he tends to communicate incompetence through the use of sarcasm, mockery, and ridicule. And so throughout the course, we will occasionally bump into these intergenerational kinds of communicative effects. And this is one instance where we've bumped into one. It's very clear-cut in the research, and it's very dangerous. Mothers and daughters don't show the same kind of relationship. Fathers and daughters don't show the same kind of relationship. And I think this also speaks to the power of the family of origin to shape the ways in which we communicate. And so, if there's a theme to many of the things we've talked about in this session with respect to parents communicating with children, it's that parents inherently have to send certain messages to those kids. The risks, of course, are that the parents don't always intend to send those messages to the kids. And the messages that are sent often have such powerful impact that they shape and mold those children for years to come. Well, in the next session, we'll look at specific kinds of communication between parents and children, and we'll talk about things like teasing and sarcasm, and try and focus specifically on how parents communicate with their kids to see what the effects of that communication happen to be.